Hello, my name is Amy Lizette, and I'm going to be the teacher this semester for DAH 201, Visual Narration, Africa, America. So the way that this is going to work is that we're going to start with traditional African art, and we are going to go through this art geographically rather than by time period, simply because many of these materials are ephemeral or temporal. So they are made in materials that do not last, right? So there are works in clay, and there are some works in stone and metal, but this is not the majority of works. The majority of works are going to be in wood. There's also textiles and other ephemeral sort of materials. So for that reason, we are going to go geographically instead of historically. So we're going to cover the continent of Africa, not all countries, and you may have questions about why we're covering what we are covering in this class. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that when you go into a museum, they have certain things that are on display, and there's a lot that is not on display. And so my goal is to help you to be able to understand what you're looking at for many of the pieces that you will see in an African art exhibit. This necessarily means that there are millions of other art forms that we are not going to get to look at. So once we have covered traditional African art, we're going to very briefly look at the Caribbean and altars and other religions like Voodoo and Santeria. And then we're going to look at contemporary art in the African diaspora, so primarily American and European works created by artists who are African and have moved out of Africa, or who are descended from people from Africa, as well as contemporary works by Africans who are living in Africa at that time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me just 1 second here. So I wanted to show you, obviously this is Africa, okay? And I want to remind you that what we are looking at is an entire continent, right? This is not the country of Africa. This is a massive, massive continent. All right, so we're going to be starting in West Africa here. And we're actually going to be looking very briefly at Sierra Leone here, as well as Liberia just below, and Mali. So our emphasis is primarily going to be on Mali. So let me go ahead and get us started. So we are using Luna. This is this image database that is available to everyone at CCS. And hopefully you will be able to use it and utilize it. So there is going to be another video on the construction of the African canon. So I'm going to leave a lot of this. But what I do want to point out to you right now is that African art has been seen as something that is very intriguing for hundreds of years, right? And so these objects have been collected in the West, in Europe, for hundreds of years. And so what you're looking at here is an image that was taken before 1914. And you can see that it has all of these objects, these African objects. And hopefully you'll kind of start to know what some of these are over the course of the semester. So these are ceremonial blades. These are heads of an oba from the Benin Kingdom. Okay, there's a lot here. It does mostly seem to be from the Benin Kingdom. That's what these figures and these are. But there was this interest in collecting African art for what was known as a cabinet of curiosities. And this is a precursor to a museum like what we know today. And so these objects would be stored in this cabinet of curiosities. And it would be shown off by the people who owned it. And it would contain everything. Okay, let me see if I have any other images of it. Yeah, so this is an example of a cabinet of curiosities. And so it would range from everything from, right, so here you see what might be Greek or Roman or antiquity, right? So sculptures from antiquity alongside taxidermied animals, alongside objects that were taken from Africa, alongside there were often human remains displayed in these, etc. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to talk to you first about salt cellars. So these are from Sierra Leone, and these are made of ivory. Now, the way that Luna works is that you have the image here, and then when I'm giving you a slideshow, you have information here on the right. So you can see a little bit more information about this work than what I'm going to tell you, but you can see that it is 15th to 16th century, so it's 1490 to 1540. So this is one of the older works that we will be looking at in this class. And we're going to be looking at a few of these objects, and these are called salt cellars because this orb here at the top is actually a bowl with a lid. And so what you would do is you would store salt in here and you would keep it covered to protect the salt. So nowadays, salt is very common, right? It's very inexpensive. I actually have 3 different containers of salt on my desk right now because I really love salt. But back before salt was so common, it was extremely valuable. Think about the difference in your food with salt and without salt, okay? And salt would have been reserved for people in the upper ranks of society. It was very useful. It could be used to preserve food. It made things heck of a lot tastier, right? It's very valuable. And so to have something like this salt cellar, and salt cellars, that term applies to other containers, lidded containers that were made to hold salt, not just these ivory objects from Africa. So these were common, and they were intended to show off the wealth of the person who owned these objects. And these are actually pre-colonial. So this is before the colonization of Africa. This is before of the transatlantic slave trade, okay? This is actually 150 years before that really gets going. And so what is really interesting is that at this time, Africans were seen as being relatively equal to Europeans. They were seen as interesting and as people worthy of and deserving of respect. And so what we see are these objects that are created by African craftspeople, but they blend African style with Portuguese style. So these are called Afro-Portuguese, right? To reflect that there is this combination of the 2 styles. So this is a different salt cellar, but again, this is from Sierra Leone, 1490 to 1530, and again, made of ivory. So ivory is known as white gold. It is extremely valuable. You can see here that this is the cellar itself. This is the lid, and you can see these figures here, and here you see someone who is actually wearing armor and probably chainmail. You can see these snakes, just the level of detail in this object. And so these would be commissioned by the Portuguese. And so they would come to the African artist and they would give an idea of what they wanted. And then the African artist had a lot of leeway in what they were going to make. So I really want to show you this one because this is a great example of the combination of formal characteristics from African art combined with the Portuguese and Portuguese artifacts, etc. So again, right, what we're looking at is an ivory object designed to hold salt that has this really fabulous lid. And what you're looking at is a boat with a rigging And then in the mask, you can see this little figure peeking over and holding a club. So this is something that is Portuguese, right? This is something that would have been part of the Portuguese way of coming to Sierra Leone. Although this one is from the Kingdom of Benin, which is in Nigeria. And most of the salt cellars of this time are from either Sierra Leone or the Kingdom of Benin. But what you're looking at here is a Portuguese man. And you can tell this because the figure is bearded. And the African figures are not bearded. Okay, but you can see that this is not how you would see a human depicted in Europe at the time. So you can see that there is kind of this emphasis on these very large heads. You have this very deep relief, okay? So you have a Portuguese man depicted in an African way, which is very interesting and very unique, and a great example of syncretism, which is the combination of more than one style, etc. So these salt cellars are really, really fabulous. And if you're interested, I encourage you to look at them in Luna. They are truly exquisite. And again, these would have been used, but also placed in cabinets of curiosities. So that's going to kind of wrap it up for Sierra Leone, and we're going to move to Liberia. And I understand that this is really fast and you may have questions, you may want to dig into these things more. Unfortunately, it is a little bit daunting to think about trying to cover the entirety of Africa for the entirety of time, as well as the diaspora. And so for that reason, unfortunately, we do have to move somewhat quickly, but I am always happy to talk with you further. If there is a topic that really interests you, we can discuss if you would write a paper on it, that sort of thing. So we're going to move to Sierra Leone. And what I'm going to talk to you about is the Sande Society. Okay, so let me find a different mask. Oops, sorry, went a little too far. Okay, so we're actually just going to stick with this one. And so what you see here is a mask. Okay, this is a helmet mask. So it would go over your head like a helmet. There are different types of masks. Some would sit on the top of your head, some go in the front of your face. This one would encompass your entire head like a helmet. And what you see depicted is a female face. And you can see that it has a very elaborate hairstyle, right? And you can see from the side this hairstyle. And then this neck would have had a costume, right? So these objects are never just a static, let me rephrase that. They're rarely just a static object like you see in a museum. So if you were to go to a museum, you would probably see an object like this displayed on a pedestal, and you would look at it like this. That is in fact not how these objects would be seen in their culture of origin. These objects are they are very artistic and they are very beautiful, but they had a definite function other than being simply beautiful. So much of the work that we look at, the form is as much a part of the function as the actual function. And these pieces tend to have symbolic or religious significance, and they would often be performed. So these are multi-sensory pieces. This is not something that you would see static like this. Seeing the holes around the neckline is a little bit disconcerting, but it would have had probably raffia or some sort of fibrous material surrounding it. And it would be this all-encompassing sort of costume. So this is not from the same society, but just to kind of give you an idea, right? These masks, you would not see the person who is performing the masks. There would be this all-encompassing costume. And so another thing that I really want you to think about is not only are these not static objects, but it would be multi-sensory. So it would be more than just vision, okay? So you would have seeing it, so vision, but you would also have things like the sound of the music and the dancing, and think about the costumes rustling. I don't know if anyone has ever seen Nick Cave. the costumes that Nick Cave makes and that are performed, they are often drawn from an African sort of precedent or aesthetic. But there was a performance in Detroit a few years back, and one of these, more than one of these sound suits were performed, and there was the rustle, right, of the material, the raffia, the cotton, right, just rubbing against each other. There's the sound of the dancing. You would also have things like smell, right? So these would be performed typically in front of a lot of people. So you would have like all the effects of a crowd. You would have sweat and dirt. All of these things would combine and create this really immersive, multi-sensory experience. So I really want you to keep this in mind and think about how different these objects would be in their culture of origin, how differently they were intended to be seen and perceived. So to come back to this specific society, so this is the Sande Society, and this is from the Mende peoples. And Sande is the women's association. There's a men's association called Poro. And for Sande, all women belong to it, and it protects women's rights and the health of the community. It's essentially a sorority that serves to build permanent bonds throughout life, and it extends beyond villages. And in order to become an adult, this is a rite of passage. This is something that you have to do in order to be no longer a girl, but now you are a woman. You would undergo this ceremony in which these masks are used and performed. This is a very interesting performance in that this is the only instance in sub-Saharan Africa of women performing carved wooden masks. So you'll see a lot of feminine carved masks. They're all performed by men. And you have these costumes that have additions in order to make the body look feminine, right? So they'll have breasts, they'll have very emphasized buttocks, right? All these things, but they're men performing them. And this is women. And there is secrecy surrounding most of these societies. And for the Sande, it is the same. Men are not allowed to attend. So, and I will say that this is potentially upsetting. I'm only going to talk about it very briefly, but there is excision practiced by this society, which is also known as female genital mutilation. But I'm not going to get into that very much. So this ceremony begins around puberty at the end of the rainy season. So November, December, and it happens roughly every 5 years. And these girls who go through this rite of initiation are instructed in the secrets of womanhood. So things like social values and moral behaviors and lessons, modesty, diligence, respect for elders, singing, dancing skills, preparation for living in a polygamous society, etc. So this ceremony involves the girls who are taken by the Sande Society, and they are taken into the bush, and there they receive their training, and they also undergo excision. So excision is the process of removing the clitoris. And that is done to transform sexually ambiguous children into heterosexual adults. So the idea is that there is an energy that pervades all of us, and children have energy of both male and female until they hit puberty and they undergo their rite of passage. So boys during puberty, so roughly the age of 15, they undergo circumcision and girls undergo excision. And in some societies, this has to do with the fact that the foreskin on the penis is seen as enclosing and so is seen as feminine. And so the removal of the foreskin allows the boys to become men with only masculine energies, whereas for girls, the clitoris is seen as protruding. And so that is much more masculine, it's more phallic. So the removal of that allows for only feminine energy. So during the process of excision, a girl dies and is reborn as a woman and takes a new name. During this ceremony, sex is forbidden, but marriage often follows immediately after, and men help to pay for the initiation. And at the end of this ceremony, these girls are presented to the community as adult women, and they have a new name. And they wear white to show that they are part of this sorority. This is the color of Sunday. So these masks are called Sowe masks. And Sowe is the name of the leader of the Sunday. So this is the dancer, teacher, healer, judge of women. And the name comes from the water spirit that it represents. And it's kept in a special enclosure, and there it has powerful medicine surrounding it and being used in conjunction with it. So by medicines, I don't mean like a pill, like ibuprofen, for instance, that you take and it helps you, but rather these medicines are designed to manipulate the energy that pervades everything. And so these are called Hale, Hale. And so the Sawe masquerade mediates between the community and the Sende society. And it makes these powerful medicines or Hale visible while representing the ideal Mende womanhood. So again, the Mende are the ethnic group that uses this performance. The masks are linked to the ancestors by names, and they are called by names. And then the dances are for both beauty and for entertainment value. So these would appear publicly 3 times, these masks. So 2 to 3 days after the girls are taken for excision, this mask would come forward out of the bush, would collect food for the girls from families, tells the families how they're doing. Because this is a medical procedure, there is some amount of risk, right? There's blood loss. And so this is important in order to let the families know the girls are safe. A week following, it comes back for food, for a special dish that is prepared and eaten in the forest, and provides dates for the final celebration. And then 2 months after the start of this process, there is the coming out ceremony. And this is where these masks are danced. And at this coming out ceremony, everyone is dressed in white, and white is associated with death and mourning. So this is essentially the death of these girls being reborn into women. And so these girls would be rubbed with kaolin, which is like a clay, to make them appear white. And you'll see this in your readings. There are photo essays depicting what this looks like. And so it's very glossy, it's eye-catching. So in terms of the performance, the dancers are assisted by others because, as you can imagine, it's hard to see out of this mask. And one thing that hopefully you'll notice, and this is not exclusive to the Sende Society, is that the facial features all have meaning. So this is an example of an ideal beauty, right? So this is idealized beauty. And these masks are fairly standardized, and they're part of an entire ensemble, as I said. So what we see here is, sorry, let me click on it so that doesn't keep popping up. So what we're looking at is a face, as I mentioned before, and starting at the bottom, we see a very small mouth, right? And this encourages you to think before you speak. You need to listen instead of just speaking without thought. The ears are emphasized, as you can see on the side, right? You can see these ears. The eyes are the most beautiful part of the face, and they're seen here as downcast. They're simply slits, and this represents humility and respect. The large forehead, is symbolic of intelligence, right? It's a very large forehead, so there's a lot of wisdom that is contained within this head. And you have this abundant hair that is very, very fancifully styled. And then you also have here, this is a good example. You have these rings below, which is potentially confusing, but these are designed to represent two things. One is ripples of water as the water spirit emerges from a pool of water, obviously. And the other thing is fat. So fat rolls on your neck, right? So that indicates that there's some level of prosperity and health, which is also what the hair symbolizes, right? So health, prosperity, think about the time it would take to create this hairstyle. Okay, this takes a lot of time. This is not something that you just, throw your hair into a ponytail on the way out the door. It's very time consuming. And so it demonstrates a lot of wealth. You'll often see scarification on the cheeks. Apologies, I have way too many windows open per usual. And this is a sign of beauty. This is something that women in the society have. So you can see here that there's scarification here on the cheeks. For those of you who may not be aware, scarification is a pattern of decorative scarring. So there are tattoos that are quite common in society nowadays, but another form of this sort of body modification where you create designs or images that are beautiful is to cut the skin in a way that a scar will form. And occasionally you can enhance the scarification by implanting natural objects under, and this causes them to be more raised. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do scarification. And this is, again, something that is realistic to the time period. Okay. And that is where I'm going to leave us with Sierra Leone. So let me, I apologize, Liberia, my apologies, I misspoke there. So we are going to move to Mali. So give me just 1 second to get myself ordered. Okay. And so if you remember, right, Mali is here, and it's much bigger than Sierra Leone or Liberia, where we were. So Sierra Leone is where the salt cellars were from, and then Liberia has the Mende people group who have the Sowe society, the Sowe masking as part of the Sande society. So we're going to look now at Mali, which you can see here is quite large. Okay, very large. Okay, so this is where we are going to go now. Let me get the information. And so what we're going to start with is just a brief overview of the country and the people groups. So today it is a mix of religions. About 95% of the people who live in Mali are Muslim, but almost 100% believe in animism. So an animating energy, nature spirit. So this is what I was talking about with the powerful medicines. So again, we're going to see that idea of an energy that pervades everything. So things that are living, things that seem inanimate, right? And energy is within all of them. And certain people are able to take this energy and manipulate it and cause it to do things. So although 95% of the people in Mali are Muslim, almost 100% believe in animism. So this idea of this pervasive energy. Mali declared independence from France in 1960. And we're going to be looking at the Great Mosque of Djenné, but primarily we're going to be looking at the Bamana people. So this is not a single ethnic group, it's actually several groups of people who came together to avoid Islam in the 8th century. So this is the ones who resisted Islam. They were animists, they believed in nature religions that predated Islam in Mali. So, but first we're going to look at this mosque, and hopefully because it is a mosque, you're able to identify that this is a Muslim structure. So this is located in Genital in Mali, and it is, as I said, a Muslim mosque. And the first mosque was built around 1200. So what we're looking at here is a continuation of that. Because of the nature of the materials of this structure, excuse me, it is made of mud bricks, and mud has a way of deteriorating, and so every year it is recovered, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it, by the very nature of the material, is going to be changing. And this actually has more change than you might anticipate, because in roughly 1834, 1836, a new mosque is built by someone who conquers Jenne. And he's more conservative in terms of his beliefs. And so he wants to build a new mosque on a different site to kind of start fresh, right? So that he can impose his more conservative Muslim beliefs. And so in order to get rid of the original mosque, he blocks the gutters. And this leads to the building essentially kind of melting, right? So think about you have dried mud and then you block the gutters, so all the rain just kind of flows down it, right? This would lead to the building just kind of disintegrating. And that worked, and he built a mosque on a second site. So again, this is like 1834, 1836. So what we're looking at here is back on the original site. So in 1906-07, the citizens wanted to get rid of this conservative mosque, right? They wanted to throw off the uh, sorry, I have a heater that's on, and my cat is just, she's staring inside the heater right now. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have looked at her, but she just loves the heater so much. I apologize. Okay, so 1906-07, right? They want to move to a slightly more permissive, liberal form of Islam. And so they ask the French, who are the colonizers in Mali, to build a school on the site of the more conservative mosque, and they rebuild on the original site. And so this is a continuation of a mosque that's about 115 years old, but it has had a continuous tradition in Genital for over 800 years. So this is, as I said, built of mud bricks. And because it is made of mud, there is erosion every year. And so annually it is replastered before the rainy season. And so these bundles that you see here allow for making it a bit easier to kind of use the structures in place to apply more mud. And this is an annual celebration. So non-Muslims do not participate in any way, but the women gather the water and the children create the mud mixture, and then the men apply it. It's a way of involving the community and making sure that they're invested, as well as preserving this ancient architectural form and this holy site. So these sticks are palm, and they serve as essentially like a ready-made scaffolding. And you can see that this is a very, very tall structure. And it has very high ceilings. And this is really neat. It has essentially a sort of early air conditioning built in. So heat rises. Let me see if I have a picture. I don't. Okay, so heat rises. So at the end of the day, the heat is going to be near the ceiling, and so it's going to be cooler down on the floor. And then what happens is the roof has these little kind of round blobby things that have a hole in them, and there's a lid. And at night, you take the lid off, and the hot air leaves the building through these holes in the roof. And then the lid goes back on, and it's capped, and then it starts every day out with cool air inside this mosque. So it's a way of, keeping air circulating, making sure that it is relatively comfortable, etc. And so you can see that it has 3 minarets, and these faced east. And so it is, it has a lot of the same structures that you might be more familiar with in a mosque, but again, it is this traditional African building form. So we're going to move on away from Islam towards animism. And so I mentioned the powerful medicines for the Mende people and how that is hail. And so for the Bamana, this concept is called Nyama, Nyama. And so this is a material and spiritual power. It unites us, but it's represented unevenly in different objects or people. So children have more Nyama than adults do. And only certain people are able to really manipulate this Nyama. So you have the blacksmiths, and they have a very specialized knowledge. They are able to manage the Nyama of metal and fire, earth, wood, and animals. So they are a very powerful people within the Bamana people group. They only marry within their own communities so that the knowledge is kept in their community. They're feared and respected. They make metal tools and weapons, but they also create the religious objects that we're going to see. And they are actually quite feared because of this level of power that they have because of their knowledge. So what we're looking at, first of all, is the Chawara crest mask. And this is not a great picture, but this is an image of a contemporary performance of the Chawara. And I like it because it shows you how these objects are seen. So if you've ever seen a Chawara, it probably looks like this. This is how they are presented in a museum. And as you can see, they're formally very beautiful. They're highly abstracted. These are depictions of the roan antelope. But again, like the Sowe mask, this is not how these objects would be seen. They would be performed. And you can see here that this is a crest mask. So it goes on the top of your head, and there's basketry attached that lets you wear it as a cap. And then you have this natural fibrous costume, and you can see that it obscures almost the entirety of their person. You can see a little bit of their legs, but their face is invisible. And the way that this is performed is that not only are these individuals wearing Chawara on their head, you can see here that this is the female Chawara with the baby antelope on her back, and the male Chawara, but the dancers themselves are intended to resemble a roan antelope. And so if you can see here, they're hunched over and they're carrying sticks in their hands. And this is to create an effect of having 4 legs. So what is Chawara? Why is this important? So Chawara is an agricultural society within the Bamana, and it was developed to encourage farming. So it is educational, but it's also fraternal, right? So it's a group of people who farm together. And the Chawara is a deity. It's male, takes the form of a roan antelope. And Chawara is the one who taught the Bamana how to farm. Okay, so this is a god of the harvest, right? It has to do with fertility as well because, right, you want a fertile harvest. There was a famine, and it was caused because there was a failure to worship the Chawara. And so the Chawara Society was created. And the reason for the shape of the antelope is because this is the form that the god takes when he manifests. And so you see that here in these masks. And so this is performed at the annual harvest and before the planting of the next crop. And this is to honor Chawara and to encourage the god to bless them to create a fertile harvest. So these masks are, and these are called masks, even though we think of a mask as something that goes in front of your face. And even though these are crests, these are considered masks. So they're made from one piece of wood. And as I said before, right, they have a woven basketry around to help it stay on the head. And these are highly abstracted composites of humans and animals. So you can see that there is some scarification on these faces. Okay, so you can see some scarification here on the forehead. Right, so this is a human characteristic. You can see scarification here, as well as, excuse me, decorative piercings on the ears. The baby antelope has not had scarification yet, and so the face is smooth, but you can see that here. And so that is the human component combined with the animal. And you can see how much the head is emphasized, as well as the horns. And these are always performed in a male-female pairing, as you can see here. Again, this is because of the implications of fertility related to the harvest, etc. And so the male has an unnaturally large mane, and the horns are very large, and these are intended to resemble millet stalks. So this is a very important crop. The zigzags here symbolize the sun's rays. And the raffia costume with which it is paired symbolizes water, the sound that it makes, etc. And the female symbolizes earth and is always portrayed with a baby on her back. Again, right, this idea of fertility. The baby symbolizes humanity while the mother is earth, and the female is always smaller than the male. And so you can see that there are different variations. Here, this one has a very large penis. Again, that will be related to the idea of fertility, and very extensive representations of scarification. These take a lot of different forms, right? You can see this is much more simple. And this is a different style of chihuahua, but it is a chihuahua nonetheless, as is this. So you can see that there's a lot of variety, but the overall idea, the association is the same. So I'm going to talk next about Ntomo, and this is a society. Similar to the way that the Sande is a society, the Ntomo is for the transition from childhood to adulthood, and this is for boys only. Again, it's quite similar to the Sande society. The boys who are pre-puberty, roughly ages 7 to 12, this association, Ntomo, meets every 4 to 7 years with a new group of boys. And the boys leave the town and they stay in a wilderness camp for a couple of months. They have these shared experiences and lifelong relationships. As well as learn practical information about adult manners such as diplomacy, polygamy, hunting, medicinal properties of wild herbs, ethical and moral behavior, relationships, etc. So everything that these boys need to become men. And they are challenged to discover their own character and learn how to be respectable men in the community through physical, spiritual, and emotional challenges. And they also undergo circumcision. So in the way that the girls in the Sande society undergo excision, boys undergo circumcision. As I said before, the foreskin is seen as feminine because it encompasses the penis. And so the removal of that removes the feminine energy, the feminine niyama from these boys, and allows them to really lean into their masculine energy. So what we're seeing here is an Ntomo mask, and this is a face mask, so more what you would expect in front of the face. It's not a crest mask as the Chihuahua was, nor is it a helmet mask, which is the all-encompassing, almost barrel-like shape that would go over the head. So again, there are a lot of similarities between these societies, and the formal characteristics of this face has a lot in common with the Sowe mask, the female Sande mask. So again, we're going to see a small mouth, which encourages you to think before you speak, make smart decisions. You have the very large forehead to emphasize wisdom and intelligence. The long nose indicates the need to use all your senses, right? So you need to listen, you need to be aware of your surroundings, etc. You have very refined features to symbolize civilization and culture, self-control, patience, poise. You'll often see scarification, right? So you can see the scarification here. And scarification is also a sort of rite of passage as well as a beautification. And the horns have a certain symbolism. They can be, depending on the number, it can be masculine or feminine or androgynous. And these are used at the coming out ceremonies. So after the boys have gone into the wilderness and undergone all this training and education and had their circumcision performed, they come back and there is a performance of this ntomo mask. And that there, I have a couple of examples for you to see here. So this is a different example, and you can see that the horns have been broken off, but there is this, these berries or seeds have been applied to this face. And again, you can see elements, the formal elements like the small mouth, the long face, the elongated nose, right? The large forehead, all of these things. And that is Ntomo, which is the initiation society for boys. Next, I want to talk to you about Como, which is the male association. So we're going to discuss Como, which is primarily going to focus on these masks, as well as a more static structure that is not performed. And then we're going to look at cloth and finally finish with photography. So Como is the male association. Only men can belong to the association, and it is a secret society. Women and children are not allowed in this society, obviously, because it's a male society, but they're also not allowed to observe what this society does. The head of the society, this Como society, is called the Como Tegi. And this is a blacksmith, and it's the head of the association. And this is the person who creates this object. And this is the Como mask. It's also called Como Kun, which literally means the head of Como. And only the blacksmith makes these. And only the blacksmith who made this object is able to control it. So this association is designed to keep the community stable. So it acts as a judiciary branch. They enforce the law, they provide security, they fight antisocial behavior and witchcraft. And as I said before, women and children are not allowed to participate or even witness masquerades or even these objects. And this is for their protection because this involves a lot of nyama, right? So that is the power that pervades everything. And if the nyama is mishandled, it can cause infertility, illness, death to those who are not familiar with nyama and its ways and its secrets and its powers. And those are things that are taught in the Como society, even though not everyone is able to manipulate them in the way that a blacksmith would. And so when there is some sort of Como performance, there are drums, and these tell the uninitiated, apologies, to stay indoors, and they're very threatening. So to discuss this work, it is a wooden structure, and you can see that it has a very thick, uneven sort of accretion. You might be curious what it is. We don't know. So the nyama that pervades everything is manipulated in order to create this specific form. So as I said before, it is wooden, but then this object receives patinations. So these aren't necessarily sacrifices, but it would receive things like mud and blood and food would be rubbed on this in order to intensify the nyama, right? The power within. And you can see that these are quills. It has horns. So quills symbolize aggression, violence, poison. Claws, oh, actually, I apologize. I think these are claws. Also symbolize aggression. Horns symbolize wisdom and knowledge and power. So you can see how this is something that is very aggressive, potentially violent, but also requires a lot of knowledge and wisdom. And these are created in order to act for the society. And so the only person, as I said before, who knows what's in it is the blacksmith who makes it. And the only person able to manipulate this object and the niyama associated with it is, again, this singular blacksmith. And if the blacksmith were to die and there was one of these objects, it would be removed and placed in the wilderness and allowed to decay, because anyone besides that singular blacksmith doesn't know what went into this. They don't know what powers it has. And so they cannot manipulate this object. Only the creator can. And these would be performed, right? These would be danced. They would be worn on top of the head. And this is performed at night. Okay, so think about, you've heard all about how dangerous this is, right? It's very violent, it's very aggressive, it's incredibly powerful, it's dark, so you have the costume, there's this dancing, and then, this is amazing, it will be rubbed with phosphorus, and phosphorus glows, so it would appear to be spitting fire. So this is very, very impressive. And again, this is danced by someone who is anonymous. You cannot tell who it is. Who they are is not important. What's important is this object and the power that it holds and that it represents. The women and children are kept indoors. They cannot receive any of the information. They cannot witness this, none of it. In between performances, this object would be kept in a private enclosure where it would receive these patinations of herbs and various things with niyama inherent. So patination is, in this context, it would be the application to the surface of things like blood and maybe mud with herbs mixed in, all these sorts of things. Again, this is not a sacrifice, but a way of building up the niyama and making it more powerful. So I mentioned before that these are only kept if they work. If it does not work, it is abandoned in the wilderness and a new one is created. This object would be performed 3 times a year. So on the anniversary of Como, during circumcision, and at the end of the dry season. And this practice, this belief system has been around since at least the 13th century, but was outlawed by the French colonials who drove it underground. They burned these masks, they sold them, they confiscated them, they sold them in Europe. So one thing that has motivated a lot of colonization is the idea of salvation. And it can be Muslim, or in this context, it's often Christian. And so missionaries would go and attempt to convert the indigenous peoples. And so objects like this could be brought back. So think about if you were living in the 19th century and they brought back an object, right? And they said that this is something that is seen as very powerful in the communities that we're serving, but they have given it up and they have accepted God and we've taken this idol from them, right? So having something physically to display would be powerful. And so this is why not all objects, yes, that was a salt container. This is why not all objects are burned. So these objects were brought back and they were placed in cabinets of curiosities. And these objects, some of them would have been stolen, some would have been confiscated. It's possible some of these were sold. This society is still in existence, it's still practiced, and it's incredibly problematic to see these objects in museums. Bamana people often will not go into museums. They hold a komokun in their collection because they don't know if it still holds the power. So remember how I said that only the person who made it is able to manipulate the nyama that resides within it. They don't know if it was stolen. It is possible for a creator to remove the power of the nyama, but they don't know that that has happened. And these are extremely powerful within this belief system. Okay. The DIA actually has a Komo-kun, or a Komo society mask. So I'd like you to just kind of think about that. How do you feel about the fact that there's this really, really rich history to these objects? They're formally very intriguing. There's a lot that we can learn from them, but this is not something that was ever intended for us to learn. This is not something we were ever supposed to see. And how do you feel about the fact that these objects are displayed as a work of art, as an oddity in a cabinet of curiosities? Okay, so another Como Society mask, you can see that they're very different. They're usually roughly zoomorphic, so having a somewhat animal shape. Here you can see that this has, here listed on the right-hand side, has porcupine quills, earth, glass, plant fibers, bird skull, animal horns, wood, and this patina. So again, we don't know exactly what's in it, but there is a lot that is here. Again, another example. And this is a society shrine for the Como. And so this is where the mask would live, as well as the boli. So this is a boli. This is a power object or an altar for the Como society. It is essentially an immobile Komo-kun. So it is very similar to the mask, except that it is not performed. It is a storehouse for nyama that can act to achieve certain ends. Again, these are made by a blacksmith and owned by the association. It's more like a protective amulet rather than a shrine. So again, this is not something that receives sacrifices so much as receives power from objects being added to it. So both of these are examples of a living art form. These are not objects that once it is created, it is done, right? It's finished, sign your name, complete. These are living, not quite breathing, but they receive food, right? All of these things. And so this is a very much a living art form. These are made of one piece of wood. They can also have something inside of them. Again, this is something that is not intended to be seen by the public at large. And again, it would be kept in a shrine like this, which is not something that just anyone could stop by and visit. An extremely powerful object. Here's another example. But you can see that they have this roughly sort of bovine or cow-like shape. All right, the last traditional, and you can see that this one is in fact much more anthropomorphic, so humanoid. The last traditional objects that I want to talk to you about are called bogolamfini, and this is called mud cloth. That's the other term for it, and this is a textile. Bogolamfini is a female art form. It is made by women. And the term bogolamfini, bogo means mud and fini means cloth. These are an example of an ephemeral art form, like I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. So you can see why we go geographically rather than historically, right? So you would not see a Komo-kun that is hundreds of years old. They're only as old as the blacksmith who made them, right? You're talking about cloth that is worn frequently, right? These are not things that exist for a very long time. So to the best of my knowledge, no bogolamfini exists from before the 1920s. And this is a very long process. So you would gather iron-rich mud from a dry stream bed, dry stream bed during a dry season, and you let that mud ferment for a year. It's very iron rich, and that iron settles. And you soak cloth in a tannin solution, which uses a specific type of leaf and other ingredients to create a yellow cloth that is dried in the sun. And you repeat this process several times. And then you go in and you outline the designs with this mud. And that acts to dye the cloth. All of this is done by hand. This is not stenciled. It's all freehand. You would paint the borders in first and then fill in the negative spaces. So you would, this would be easier if I could use my finger for you, but you would paint in these borders and then you fill in the negative space. So the white is the natural appearance of the cloth after you have bleached it. And you can also go over the white areas again with a sort of caustic soda to bleach the area white. And the way that this is done is, as I said, borders, negative space, painted with mud. So you would paint it with mud, you would wash it, put it in the sun to dry. You do this 3 times. So this is a very labor-intensive process. And the price of something like this depends on how complex the pattern is and how big it is. So something that you may have noticed is that this utilizes a mud that has iron in it, and iron is seen as being very powerful because it has a lot of niyama. And so these women are not manipulating iron in the way that you might think of with someone who's an iron worker. They're using mud that has iron in it, but this leads to a cloth that has a fair amount of niyama. And so these cloths would be used for things like wrapping a hunter before he goes out to hunt, which is obviously a dangerous proposition in and of itself. These cloths could be buried with people. Girls are wrapped in these cloths before they undergo excision. So basically, anytime when something important is happening or you are potentially in danger, this cloth could be used to protect you. As I said before, it's made only by women, and some of these designs are essentially a secret language. And so there are secret meanings encoded within these objects that are not known to anyone but the women in that society. So what you might notice here is that this is not perfectly symmetrical, right? You can see how this area is much more dense. It has a lot more white than over here. Not all of these squares are the same size. This is intentional. These are mistakes, right? You have hundreds of designs and motifs, and you also don't want to create something that is perfect. Perfection can be seen potentially as the realm of a deity, and that's not somewhere you want to go, right? So these are very intentionally asymmetrical in terms of the pattern. And new symbols are always being created. You can arrange them in different ways, etc. And this, so just some more examples of Bogolanfini. And you may have actually seen Bogolanfini here in the West in clothing items. So Chris Seydoux was from Mali, and he was a fashion designer who died in 1994. And you can see here that he utilized Bogolanfini or mud cloth in his work. And this became very popular, and you would see these sort of patterns, obviously not made in this traditional way because that's very labor intensive and expensive, but you would see them in home furnishings and clothing, etc. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is photography. So photography is developed in 1830s, 1840s, and it arrives in Africa in the 1850s. And again, I just wanted to reiterate that because we are going geographically, there is a little bit of a time jump here, but it's worth noting that the photography would have existed simultaneously with everything else that we have seen from Mali today. So Um, the mosque, right, is still resurfaced every year. The Chawara performance is still done every year, as is, well, not every year for the Ntomo, but that is still practiced. The Como Society is still active. Bogolamfini is still made. There are actually factories where it is produced in this traditional way, but to create this cloth. And so it's important that you realize that we have this view of Africa as being static and frozen in the past. And that is, you know, this old untouched way. And it's really important that you realize that this is still, these art forms are still being utilized. They're still being practiced in these communities, as well as combined with contemporary life, right? So if you were to go to Mali, you wouldn't just see mud architecture, but you would also see much more what we think of as contemporary architecture, all of these things. And so it's really important that you realize it's not frozen in the past. Okay, and so photography is not incongruous in this context. So what you're looking at here is not by a Malian photographer. Photography is brought to Africa and used in the 1880s to document the progress of civilization. So things like railroads and construction, as well as cranial types and body types. So what you see here is a small boy being measured against a measuring stick here. This is Cabo. These two lines in front of his name are clicks. I believe he's from South Africa. And so you can see here that he's being measured. And so we're going to be talking more about social Darwinism or scientific racism later in this class. It's actually going to be a relatively common feature. But in the 19th century, and earlier, as well as the 20th, there's this idea that an extremely problematic idea. So hopefully you are familiar with this idea, right, of starting out kind of hunched over, right, and then progress developing to where we are now. So there was this idea that white humans, white Europeans, were at the far right of this scale, and people who had different skin color were farther back in this evolutionary process. And so there was this fascination, this obsession with measuring African bodies and Indian bodies and anyone who looked different in an attempt to prove that, oh, they have a smaller cranial structure, therefore their brains are smaller, therefore they are not as evolved, etc. And so you can see how photography could kind of give this credence, right? So you have this this object that seems very scientific, right? Photographs can be very scientific. They can be used for documentation. And so if you have this indisputable proof of smaller head sizes and smaller intelligence and smaller bodies that are perhaps, you know, they have slightly different proportions, all of these things were used to justify this horrific racism. And so this is why photography comes to Africa. It comes to document the strangeness. So this is where you'll see like pictures of women wearing veils and the pyramids, and it's all like, oh, wow, this is all so different from us. And it's also used to document how Europeans have taken over the continent, as well as how people who are not white are of a lesser form. Okay, so you can see that this is incredibly problematic. This is really, really immoral. And so when the colonizers and the military are finally starting to leave the continent in the 1950s and 60s, Malian photographers purchase this equipment from the people who are leaving, and they want to portray themselves differently. Okay, so they want to go from this to deciding how they will be portrayed. So this idea of agency, how do I want to depict myself? They wanted to show themselves as modern rather than the backwards individuals, the way the colonial people had portrayed them, or the colonizers. And so they're using this new Western technology to indicate modernity. And starting in the 1950s and early 60s, the cameras start to get smaller and smaller, so they become more mobile. And you start to see studio photography like what you're seeing here, in addition to party photography. And so it's not just about celebrating freedom, but maintaining a freedom that they don't have. So after 1965, they have a president who is anti-Western, and it becomes very difficult to obtain Western things. So women are not allowed to wear short skirts, no afros are allowed. So these things are all seen as very rebellious. And so this photography and these parties is seen as a subversive sort of way of demonstrating the modernity of these Malian people. So there are some formal characteristics, and the photography that we're going to be looking at is by Seydou Keita and Malik Sidibe. Sorry, blanked for a minute there. So formally, these often employ a low vantage point that forces the viewer to look up, right? So think about the statues that you see when you go to an art museum. Oftentimes they're placed on a pedestal and you look up at them, right? And so it's the same sort of idea, aggrandizing the person who is depicted, putting them above you. They often have these incredibly vivid backgrounds. They're often a batik. Batik is a fabric that is most closely associated with Africa and is very vibrant and colorful and has very busy patterns. Oftentimes, Seydou Keita invented this specific composition that is roughly diagonal. And so a person would lean in one direction and the camera would tilt in the opposite direction to create this sort of diagonal composition that adds depth and energy and is more dynamic. These backdrops, as I said, are highly ornate, and it's very unique to West African photographers, and it's very intentionally flattening the space. It's not like, I don't know if anyone here ever had like school pictures where you would sit in front of a backdrop that tried to make it look like you were out in the woods, right? There is not that level of artifice here. This is clearly stating this is studio photography. That is what you are seeing. So you see these people who are portrayed almost majestically. They are taking control of how they want to be seen. And so you see like this, but then you also see the incorporation of objects that demonstrate modernity. Okay, so here you see a man who has these very snazzy glasses. He's wearing a watch, and he's very clearly showing that he has a pen and a pocket protector. This is 1958 to 1959 by Seydou Keita. And this is how this individual is asserting his modernity, right? This is not backwards people who, you know, are like, whoa, about photography. This is something that they are able to use to manipulate, and they can show that they themselves are modern as well. All of these works are going to be untitled because we don't know the names. But again, right, you can see here that there's this little scooter. Oftentimes these would be studio props, but people would be very excited to have their picture taken with these objects. Here you see, it's called Lovely Daughter, right? So father and daughter. Here's an example of the party photography that I mentioned by Malik Sidibe. And this is taken on Christmas Eve. You can see them dancing, wearing Western clothing. 1963, so this is just before when Western things became outlawed. But again, right, everyday life, but also this assertion of modernity. You don't often see smiling because that is seen as a contortion of the face. It's less mature. And these were made for the people who were being depicted for themselves and to give to friends and family. But they were discovered by the West in the 80s to 90s. And in the early 90s, collectors start to become very interested in this photography. They are this style, these images themselves are utilized in pop culture. Janet Jackson utilized a lot of this imagery in, I believe, Got Till It's Gone. But obviously, this is not something where these photos were taken and a lot of credit was given to Seydou Keita or Malik Sidibe. These were displayed and the photographers were not credited and they were not paid. So you can just kind of see some of this, right? And so this is probably a political figure from 1962. So this is something that is it's a moment that's frozen in time, but an example of modernity. This one's really great. So this is a picnic. And you see here these boys who are incredibly proud of their records. And they're fooling around like this in 1972. So again, right, just think about agency and how important it is to be in control of how you are seen, right? I imagine that all of you have ways that you want to be seen, ways that you don't want to be seen. I have multiple facial piercings because that's one way that I want to be seen. And so this is an example of agency, right? And taking back this idea of only being portrayed by other people. So this was a long one. Hopefully it was informative and I will see you again soon. Bye.